Business Today, I am Rowena Kajumba, joined by our analyst here, Timothy Sibasi, and we're looking at the budget over the past 32 years, of course, in this case, preparing ourselves for the 32 years of NRM, that is by the 26th of January. And these are some of the things that we need to focus on as a business world, or rather focus on in regards to our economy. Very interesting, though, here on how our economy has transitioned over the years, especially if you look at the fact that there was some sort of major fluctuations there. Of course, that is, we started off vibrant in the 60s, and then 70s and 80s we saw some sort of imbalance there, of course due to certain issues like insecurities and all. But again, very interestingly though, in the 80s when the NRM did come in power, they said, well, we need to focus on some key areas, especially to make sure that we have a sort of plan. Maybe, for example, the 3-year plan that started as early as the 90s. But looking at the fact that from the start, they said we need to have a plan to deal with certain imbalances here, the fluctuations that we've been dealing with. But first of all, you're welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Yes, how is your morning?
Not bad. And yours?
Quite okay, I must say.
Well, getting to your question now. Well, issues that the NRM grappled with in the 80s, the 1980s budgets, because when I start analyzing the NRM struggles to fix the economy, the budget performance and the tax revenue base, you need to look at what was Uganda's budgets and tax revenue base of the 1970s. Just a quick flip through what had befell the tax revenue base of the country that forms the basis of the NRM economic reforms of the 80s. The 1970 to 74,
Yes.
75 budgets, those budgets faced an astronomical deficit of about 50 to 60%. In fact, in 1974, Uganda's budget faced a deficit of 100%, with the exception of 1977 to 78. But of course, you will understand that the reason of those deficits at the time were arising from inefficiencies within the government, government borrowing, excessive government borrowing, smuggling, low production and trade. But in 1974, there was need to refrain government, to tame government from doing a lot of borrowing. But even when that was an option on table, Amini continued his games to do with excessive borrowing, allowed government to borrow from 50 to 70%. Now that affected the economy. Now we get to now the 1980s budgets to 1989 budgets. The issues on table was, how do we fix the economy?
Yes, indeed.
Now, in 1980 budget, there was need. The first thing, the country started seeing increase in the revenues. Cautious, I'm using the word cautious increase. But now when it came to 1982 to 89, because I'm analyzing those budgets now, there was need to put limits on government borrowing, domestic credit. This links us to realistic exchange policies that saw the shilling floating. Now, during those years, now 1983 to 85, 86, we see a lot of innovation. Now the NRM comes into power in 86. What do? The issue was to do with revenues, increasing revenues. And how do they increase the revenues? A lot of graduated taxes. They have to look into things of doing with graduated tax, because I do remember from what I've been reading, graduated tax increased from 300 shillings to about 5,000 shillings per head, somebody who was earning. So that also helped to increase the tax base. But not forgetting that during that time, also exports on coffee increased by 60%. Increased by 60%. That also laid the ground for a strong revenue base for the country. A strong revenue base for the country. 1986, when things were not working out well. Because we see in the books that we have read, we say about Uganda's tax revenue base was about 5 billion shillings. So, going forward.
So let us look at 1987 here, when we decided to come up with an economic recovery program here. But again, with support, if I could say, from the International Monetary Fund, which had always come through for some reasons to back us up.
Well, there were a lot of reforms that were done at the time, and some of these reforms were being propagated by the World Bank and the IMF. One of it was to reduce on government expenditures.
Yes.
Reducing on government expenditure also helped, though in some instances, because the government was going through a lot of security instabilities, you would see some budgets of ministries like defense, much as there was a proposal to cut it by 18%, it was not possible.
Yes.
It was not possible. The president's office budget cut was 25%. That was possible. Ministry of Finance, also its budget cuts were slashed to around from 30 to 22%. There was a lot of proposals of things to do with, but later that came in around 1993, doing with the privatization policy. A lot of government parastatal bodies where government was spending a lot of money and no results were coming out.
Yes.
They were put on, they were advised to sell them to reduce on government expenditure. There was a lot of doing there was what they call retrenching, downsizing on the number of government civil servants. We saw during that time the number of the army being slashed, retired. All those were innovations to ensure that government does not overspend and improving the tax revenue base of the country. We saw other innovations to do with how to deal with smuggling that had become a problem. But of course, that government had to do it through empowering the local authorities, the RCs of them,
Very true.
to be cautious and vigilant about people smuggling and to do with tax invaders, report to the nearby authorities, and it worked. That's what now forms a robust tax revenue base of Uganda currently, but of course there have been a lot of efforts to see how how do they create other forms of taxes? A lot of taxes have been created after slashing the graduated tax.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And some of the things that were focused on here was the dealing with stability of the macroeconomics here, and saying let us find various solutions to deal with this, especially to make sure that we stabilize on what we're looking at as our GDP. Another one very interesting, because you did talk about resources. Let us look at resource mobilization and allocation around this time.
Well, resource mobilization partly has been one of the major challenges that the government has been grappling with for quite a long period of time. But of recent, due to a robust tax revenue base that the country is having,
Yes.
we are seeing government is less, Uganda's budget is no longer heavily being funded by donors.
Indeed.
Because from the best of my collection, this financial year ending, donors are funding Uganda's budget by around 20 to 15%.
Yes.
Almost 85% of the budget is being funded by Uganda, by Ugandans. So that speaks volume on resource, how to generating resource. But when it comes to resource expenditures, also there is, well, allocation and expenditure. Well, allocation is a different thing from expenditure. Government can allocate money to sector ministries, but how is the money spent? That is the issue.
Very true.
So the moment you do not have a work plan, that's when we see many government sectors suffering from setbacks of low absorption capacities, and money ends up returning to the treasury, and people keep on complaining of they have not got the services, what and what. So it all rotates around resource allocation and expenditure. Then when you come to expenditure, there have also been, like you have been raising something to do with expenditure. Also, it's another gray area that there have been a lot of misuse of funds, which I do believe that government is finding a solution to that problem. How funds are being misused and misappropriated by some government bureaucrats.
Very interesting there. Now, real quickly, because let us look at the 3-year plan that we were looking at in the 90s, of course, by about 92, 93 was being focused on here. Do you feel that at the time, this is something that drove us to where we are now? Did it in any way solve our problems to stability?
Of course, stability has partly been solved. You know, the country cannot progress when it's suffering from political or security instabilities. The question of security instabilities has been addressed in Uganda. And I do believe it's the reason partly as to why the tax revenue base is stable. When you look at areas that suffered insecurities and you compare what they were that time to today when the country is stable, areas like northern Uganda, you see, more especially like Gulu, you see a lot of development going on. That also explains the kind of taxes that government is fetching in a stable region like that one. When you see areas like Patle Kasese, well, that was also suffering instabilities between 96 to around 2004. Government addressed it. There's a lot of development going on in the region. So the issue of stability is key to economic development and tax revenue base. The moment the country has insecurity, then it scares away investors.
Very true.
And the moment investors run away from a country, that means that country is going to suffer from a wobbling tax revenue base. It happened to Amin when he chased away the Asians. That affected the tax revenue base for the rest of the years he was in power until he was kicked out.
Indeed. Now let us look at the fiscal financial discipline here. When we look particularly on the cash budgeting, which is something, of course, we still saw in the 90s as a way of stabilizing the economy, or rather cash flow.
Physical financial discipline, well, I can say for a fact that the country is still struggling, especially Ministry of Finance, Bank of Uganda, stabilizing the shilling. Our shilling compared to how other regional shillings are performing in terms of value is still wanting. And I do believe this is an uphill task for Bank of Uganda to ensure that the Uganda's currency regains its value. Of course, they have reasons to that. They say the moment the country is suffering from low exports, cannot export much, then that directly impacts on the strength of its shilling.
Indeed.
The reason may be holding water, but also Uganda being a transit area for both East and Central Africa, we expect the shilling to be strong. Kenya's shilling is strong because of the cost.
Yes.
The cost. Uganda's shilling should be strong because it is a transit route. A lot of trade comes in Kenya. A lot of goods go through Uganda to Eastern DRC. A lot of goods go through Uganda to Rwanda and Burundi. A lot of goods go through Uganda to South Sudan, and so on and so forth. So why not our shillings to be strong? So
Yes.
there are issues in the way things are being handled at Bank of Uganda to stabilize the shilling. And unless Bank of Uganda fix that problem, we shall continue to see people carrying bulks of money
Indeed.
to go to purchase a bag of cement or bags of cement. So we need to have value for Ugandan shillings, and hopefully that Bank of Uganda is working around that. The moment we do not have value for our shillings, then we shall have problems.
Okay. Now, real quickly, the poverty eradication plan here, in this case, action plan that we did see in 1995, which is something I'm still seeing till date. Now, most of our budgets have been basically focusing
Tailored
on,
around poverty eradication.
Very true. Now, do you think that probably this is something that over the times you've seen change, you've seen some sort of difference, some sort of change, and of course we are having a 2020, 2040 target as well?
Reading from several research that have been done, indicators point to a fact that the poverty levels are dropping. There were, in the past, reports we are reading that a Ugandan live below $1 a day. But of late, Ugandans, but majority of them, I can say, are living above $1. So that is a clear indicator that the country is moving in the right direction in the fight against reducing poverty levels. When you look at, poverty is not measured in terms of buildings that you see growing up
Yes.
in the country, but poverty is measured in terms of how the well-being of a common man. If somebody can afford a meal, 3 meals or 2 meals a day, somebody can afford taking his or her child to school. Somebody can afford living in a decent house. Somebody can afford medical expenses, it shows that poverty levels are being reduced, and this is happening in Uganda.
Yes.
The issues to do with medical issues, that is a different chapter. But when you look at Ugandans now, both in the rural Uganda and the urban Uganda, the body demeanor tells you that they are no longer suffering from acute poverty levels than it was in the past.
Very interesting. Now, in 1986, the minister was a professor, the late Professor Ponciano Mulema. Now, of course, in this particular case, as we wind up, because we want you to take a look at 1986 budget and how it went down. I am very, very intrigued on how this is going to go down for people. You know, sometimes people don't know these things, so oftentimes we tend to just go by what we think we know. But interestingly, within the 2000s, or rather up to where we are now, do you see any similarities within the budgets, a trend that we have kept?
Of course, there have been a trend to do something similar that has kept on running through 10-year budgets of Uganda.
Yes.
It has been something to do with roads.
Indeed.
You have seen roads have kept on coming again and again, and issues to do with power.
Yes.
And I do believe from what we are seeing as resource envelopes to sector ministries of energy and works speaks volume to what they are doing. You know, people gauge Uganda's bad roads by somebody moves around Katwechibuye, one around comes and speaks. But
yes,
move outside Uganda, go Western Uganda, Northern Uganda, and see how roads are being made.
Indeed.
Highway roads have been fixed.
Indeed.
But the talk rotates around Pite feeder roads.
Indeed. Okay, real quickly, because we're running out of time, well, we do appreciate you for watching This Is Business Today. I am Rowena Kajumba with my colleague here, who is a business analyst, that is Timothy Sibasi. But right now, let us take a look at the budget of 1986. His Excellency looking very young at the time, and awaiting, of course, this is the same procedure we go through every year and all of that. And at the time, of course, the minister was the late Professor Ponciano Mulema, who went ahead and read for us this particular budget. But again, looking at the fact that coming straight from the challenges that we're facing between the 70s and 80s, they had a very huge task ahead of them as the NRM.
Well, yeah. The task that they had that actually first told the NRM performance in the economic direction was to do with insecurity of the time.
Yes.
Because I can speak without contradiction that from 1986, even after the capture, to 2005, it has been years of fixing Uganda security-wise. Because breaking the backbone of the LRA actually ended in 2005.
True.
That's when now Uganda was
Stable.
So when somebody is analyzing these things, that 25 years or 30 years of NRM, you need to say that from 86 to 2005, because it's a fact, the country was embroiled in combat fights. Stability, you have started seeing stability from 2006 and economic progress, 2006 going upwards. So a lot of Uganda's budget between 86 and 2005 was going to Ministry of Defense. And Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Education, those consumed a lot of budget, budget allocations because of the problems that the country was caught in. So when somebody start portioning blames here and there, he need to look at about 15 years to 20 years of fighting, fixing northern Uganda and western Uganda, fixing a part of eastern Uganda that was also had some small pockets of rebel groups. So that's what now forms Uganda's economic stability that it's enjoying now. Otherwise, if Uganda was stable with the brilliant brains that President Yoweri Museveni came with from the bush, if it was stable by 1986, 87, Uganda would be far, way far. But most of the time, between 87 to 2005, it was fixing the country security-wise.
So we're looking at about 20-something years of only trying to push the economy forward, about 15 years of saying now, okay, yes, we have dealt with security, we are now stable, now let us focus on the things that are really going to push us ahead.
And that's why now Ugandans have started talking about demanding for resources, demanding for development. And partly it's being given to, it's being made. When you look at the roads, let us speak the truth. Roads have been fixed. You drive from here to Gulu, from here to Padel, from here to Busoga, from here to West Nile in areas of Waraba and so on and so forth. People are driving on tarmac roads.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Very true. And you can still see some roads being worked on. Well, I must say it's time for us to sign out. I am Rowena Kajumba, Timothy Zibasi here, who is our business analyst. We cannot exhaust this, but we did promise you that we're going to focus much on the budget. But before we do that, we shall also be looking at the 32 years of NRM, that is by the 26th of January. Now, we do leave you with the speech from the president around this time. Have a lovely day.
And approval of the budgetary proposals for the fiscal year 1986-87, estimates of revenue and expenditure. Mr. Chairman, sir, the economy of Uganda has been troubled for the last 15 years by economic mismanagement. During the 1970s, it was not even possible to assess the extent of this mismanagement in statistical terms, because the entire administrative system had almost ceased to function. Even when the military government was overthrown in 1979, the economy could not recover because of the insecurity that prevailed. Misallocation of national resources and lack of guidance and direction. Mr. Chairman, between 1972 and 1979, the economic conditions forced Ugandans to move away from production to commerce and services, where these were still possible. During this period, therefore, little production for export took place, although production of coffee continued somewhat because of the very nature of the crop, while other exports like cotton suffered from substitution effect as people switched to production of locally consumed commodities whose prices rose steadily in response to the declining value of the shilling. Mr. Chairman, this low level of production, both in agriculture and industry, was reflected in the trends of gross domestic product. It was not, however, possible to get reliable statistics. Such figures as we now have are rough estimates based on a few statistics available and lots of assumptions. Between 1978 and 1980, Mr. Chairman, there was a further marked drop in gross domestic product as a result of the war that was taking place then. And although gross domestic product recovered somewhat between 1980 and 1983, most of the recovery was accounted for by increases in